Hát jó. Egyszerre kétnyelven.
Ja.
Ilyen rendben.
Can we start?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. Welcome to the Traveler's Office. It's great having you all here. We have a special guest tonight. Károly is going to present. He has a presentation about the Drupal entities. But first, so first I would like to. I don't know who are new here and who have been to Drupal meetups before, but what we do, what we decided to do recently is, at the beginning, everyone introduces himself in a sentence or two. So let's themselves in a sentence or two. So let's do it tonight. I will start. My name is Károly. I'm the CTO of Shepherds and your host tonight. And I started working with Drupal about 8 years ago, and I know I used to be a Drupal developer, but now I don't really have much time for coding anymore. Thank you. Adam?
Hi, my name is Adam. I started using Drupal at version 4.6.5, and for the past 7 years I'm working at Central European University as Drupal architect in a small team of 5 where we maintain all the websites of the university.
Sure. Hi, I'm Károly Négyesi. I work for a.k.a. I started using Drupal 12 years ago, 4.3 point something, and not really exactly. 4.3 point something. And then mostly involved with the multilingual initiative.
Hi all, my name is Budapest. I started using at some time 4.7 as I remember. Mostly you know me about leading the Hungarian localization, and I'm working as a content manager and graphic designer for a web store, which is unfortunately not running yet.
My turn. Hi, my name is Károly. I have been working here at Shepherds as a Drupal developer. I started with Drupal 6, 6 years ago. I think it's done. Thank you.
My name is Zoltán. That's Shepherds is my first workplace, but I don't know, I made some development work. I work here for 3 years, I guess. And that's all. I'm a front-end developer.
Hi, I'm Tonto Gábor. I'm working at Shepherds since February, and I'm also a front-end developer, and I'm working with Drupal since 2006. First year, this is just a hobby for me, and later this is my main job.
Hi, my name is Markis. I'm working with Drupal for a few years. I'm a front-end developer, and right now I work together for that one.
Hi, I'm Miro. I'm from Slovakia. I'm with Drupal for 3 years now, and I've been learning different
Hi, I'm István Ferhet. I am working with Pesto. I started work with Drupal 6.
Okay, hi, I'm Popular Class. I started working with Drupal 6. I worked with 7 as well, for some small freelance projects. Then with Shepherds as a Drupal developer. Now I'm working as a DevOps engineer in connection with Drupal sites.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm a development here at Senseo.
my programming career started as a C programmer, and I've been working with Drupal for 4 years now.
Hello, I'm Károly. I'm working here. I'm a cloud engineer and I provide I've used Drupal before and maybe supervising will be my version. So, hi, I'm Boris. I'm working here, started this year, and I started, I guess, with Drupal 6.
Hi, my name is Ferenc. Actually, it's kind of funny you have this run here because I haven't worked with Drupal, and actually I'm not here for the food, so I'm just curious about chapters, and that's all I can say. Actually, I'm a C++ developer, and I'm working with DevOps technologies.
Welcome.
Yeah, hi.
Hi guys, I'm Julian. I'm very happy to be with you tonight. I come from France. As KU Harvard, you are running the meetups tonight, so I joined you. I worked 3 years for those guys before starting as an independent. After that, I'm also running the group, the Parisian French Drupal community. Thank you guys.
Hi, my name is Michael Pesnadi. I'm working as a freelancer and web developer at Károly. I started to use Drupal in 2006.
I'm Marisa. I'm a project manager at and I haven't worked with Drupal yet. I'm here for the food.
Uh-oh.
My name is Jean-Paul. I have been working with Drupal for 10 years or more. My nickname is Drupal switcher. So, and I'm also a backend developer.
Hello, my name is Norbert Lansky. I have several small customers and some users, and I'm starting with Drupal 5.
Hi, my name is Károly. I was working with Drupal for approximately 4 years as a backend developer, but now I'm working for Chapters as a cloud engineer.
Hi, my name is Károly. I'm site builder at Károly. I just learned working with Drupal.
Hi, I am Zoltán Kossai. I started with Drupal about 2004. I started with global having a course in Budapest school.
This is Tudás. I'm working with DUG-ján Négyesi group. Started Drupal 6.
Hi everyone, my name is Károly. I started with Drupal 7 about 4 years ago, and currently I'm a front-end developer in Chapters since 1 month.
Hi, I'm Gároly Négyesi. I work with Drupal 5 years now. I'm currently working for Chapters, and that's all. And I think there's a half-minute delay in the live stream.
Yes, we know.
That's better? What?
So it's already streamed?
Yes.
Okay, the whole world goes.
Fine.
Hi, my name is Budapest. I'm working at Chapters 1 year ago. And I'm a backend developer.
Hi, I'm Gergely. I'm working with Drupal since 3 years or 4 years now, and currently Python.
My name is László Kovács. I have been working at Chapters for 1 year, and that's my whole Drupal experience. Before that, I used to be a Delphi developer for more than 15 years. Because I'm too old.
Emails?
Joke disappeared?
Joke disappeared. Sándor?
Hi guys, I'm not Sándor, I'm Peter, and I'm the lead developer of Chapters, which is not a big surprise because I'm the only one. Anyway, that's all. Your turn.
Thank you.
So my name is Sándor, and I'm a project manager now, and site lead and consultant developer, and what needs. So,
Hi, my name is Károly. I work as an independent Drupal consultant, and I work Drupal with a long time. I organized a conference where Cheese meets Drupal first time, I think.
You and Goba, yes, Goba was presenting there. You can all blame him.
Okay, that was a very nice introduction. So, Károly, the stage is yours. Thank you for your support.
Okay, so my name is Károly Négyesi. My Drupal nickname is CAJAX. I work for Smartsheet and Tag One Consulting both. I have been using Drupal for about 11 years. Drupal 4.4 was my first. But today we are going to talk about a somewhat more modern version of Drupal. Let's start with Drupal 7 and field formatters. Just to check, who here have written a field formatter for 7? Okay, good. Good. So most people know what I'm talking about. That's great. So as a refresher, there's a info hook which provides machine and human readable names, not much else. And then the actual logic for the field formatter is in a function, and the name of the function is based on the module name and the convention. In case, here is the info hook for the file module, at least a small piece of it. As we can see, the identifier of the formatter is an array key, and then there's a human readable label and a few more pieces of metadata in this info hook. The logic is in function. Here's an example for it. I didn't actually copy the actual logic, just to show that, once again, here is a function which is file and then a given name which is field formatter view. The problem here is that the function name is module name based, and the ID that we have seen before needs to be switched inside this function. So this is a big problem because you always have this switch, and this is just an awful solution. It's plain awful. It means that you do not have clear encapsulation. You will have some problems with testing and so on. This is really not a nice solution. And despite that, this actually became a pattern. The same is used for field formatters, field widgets, blocks, and other things. it is weird that it became this, because the first one to use this pattern were custom node types, which have fallen out of use by Drupal 7. But those ones were originally also module based, but it was recognized that is not working too well, and we have added a base key to the node type info. But for some reason, that same key didn't survive into these field hooks or blocks. I don't really know why. Hindsight is always so much the wiser, you know? Now in Drupal 8, how does this look? This metadata comes from a class annotation. The logic is now in methods, and only the namespace is based on the module names. Of course, none of this makes any sense now if you haven't seen Drupal 8 before, so let's go over piece by piece. What is a class annotation? Here's the header of the default file formatter. And as you can see, within the class comment, there is something strange. This thing here, which is an annotation. Annotations are native to a lot of programming languages. It's a somewhat modern concept. The first, as far as I know, the first language to have native annotations were VisualWorks 3 in '98. Then other Smalltalk dialects got annotations very quickly. It spread to Java, where everybody had their own annotation implementation, and by 2006 they had a native one. Then Python got around 2006 as well annotation support. So because this is relatively new, obviously PHP doesn't have native annotation support. It's too new. Maybe in 20 years, who knows? By that time, maybe people can agree that, as every other language has native annotation support for 10 years now, maybe PHP, it wouldn't be the end of the world if it would have one. But it is blatantly obvious that PHP 7 also doesn't have native one, because that would require the PHP people agreeing, which we know cannot happen. So the only thing we can do is to hide annotations and comments like Java did 15 years ago. And again, as Java did, PHP also has a lot of annotation readers, annotation conventions. Drupal 8 only uses 2. Be glad that it's only 2. The plugins are using Doctrine. Doctrine uses annotations. Doctrine is an ORM, and it uses annotations to specify various object information. We use it for something completely else. Once again, obviously. So in here, you can see that this is a field formatter annotation, and the same as in Drupal 7, this is as you can see, this is an exact translation of the Drupal 7 field hook. There's an ID, there's a label, there's a field types. This is the exact same array. There's no difference. You can, as we will see, you can actually get this array. This is called the plugin definition. And the plugin has a method called getPluginDefinition, which will give you this array. So although it looks very weird to put machine-readable code into a comment, you can get it as an array from code. It is cached, so it's fast. It's a fairly good solution. It's an okay solution, because putting metadata anywhere else would be even worse. Where else could you put it? You could put it in a separate file, which would mean that in order to work with a plugin, you would need to have a PHP file and perhaps a YAML file open. That's not too nice. You could, of course, put it in a PHP method. Like in Drupal 7, you had tests which had a getInfo method. The problem with that is that that is PHP code. And then you can't do any static analysis with it. Caching is much more iffy. It's just problematic. There's no need for it. This is just an array. We just need to put an array somewhere. So we picked this, and this is how it is. It's perhaps not the best, but it's certainly the least worst. What can you do?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How do you get your text editor color code, this thingy? Because this thing is now a comment, so whatever is written there is considered a comment for the text editor. So it will be gray, so to say. So it will be not colored nice.
So that let me check whether PHP Storm can do it. I think it can now. There is for no, it cannot. Somebody would need to code it. Although there are pieces of so the class names like @field formatter and @translation is colored differently. So that one at least is recognized. The reason for that is that other annotations also use the It became as PHP doc have chosen as indicating a tag or something like that. PHP unit annotations, which is what we use as well, it also uses @group and similar things. So as I have mentioned in Drupal 7 tests, use the getInfo method. Now those are in Drupal 8 became PHP unit annotations. That's the other kind of annotations that we use. Because once again, obviously, there's not even, it's not just that there's no native annotations. The PHP word cannot even agree on a non-native one. There should be two very slightly different ones. It's just different enough to drive you absolutely nuts. So this is an annotation. This is how it is. This is once again the plugin definition that you can get from the plugin. The plugin is a class, and the class has a get plugin definition method which gives you this array. The namespace is based on the module name. Namespace, probably by now, if you have written any modern PHP code, it should be familiar. It was introduced in PHP 5.3. It is PHP's native way of what Drupal tried to achieve by module name underscore everything. This is PHP's namespace notation. Drupal have chosen to start everything with Drupal and then the module name. This is relatively simple, and because we are using PSR4, PSR is the standards body for PHP. Their job is to create standards that nobody uses because nobody can use them. So the few that are actually usable are used by Drupal 8, but most of them are unusable, so they are not. So PSR4 we use, and that means that the namespace, that there is a one-to-one there's a one-to-one between namespaces and directories. So if you look for the default file formatter, you will find it in modules/file /src / plugin / field / formatter. So every piece of the namespace will correspond to a directory. This makes it relatively easy to find, except of course there's a so-called module root, which for Drupal /file is modules /file /src. So you need to actually know where the roots are to find the files, but once you are used to it, it is relatively easy and straightforward. Now, as you can see, there's a different class for every formatter, unlike in Drupal 7, where you needed to switch on things. You don't need to switch on things here. You can write one class, you give it a ID. So this is nice. This is much nicer in 7. Now, there is this whole long thing, plugin field formatter. This is called a plugin type. What is a plugin type? Plugin type is a lot of things, and it is a very fundamental Drupal 8 concept. A plugin fundamentally, as we have just seen, is just a class with some metadata, nothing else. It's nothing complicated. It sounds more complicated than it is, but it's nothing else, just a class and the plugin definition. So, in order to make it possible to find these plugins, every plugin has a place where it needs to live. This is a directory or a namespace, as I said, the same. These are the same, essentially. So usually it looks like Drupal /module name /plugin / the definer module / some type. Or it can be just as simple as Drupal /module name /entity, because entity is a plugin type. We will talk a lot about that. Every plugin has an interface to implement. While Drupal 8 went fully OOP, that's like if you have seen the movie Tropic Thunder going full retard. So in a lot of times it makes no sense to go OP. In this case, it does, because a plugin type gives you an interface to implement, and that is one of the cases when OOP makes sense, because you will actually have one interface and then a lot of classes implementing it, but how the actual implementation looks doesn't matter, because everybody else only talks to the interface. This is intuitive and nice. This is probably how should field formatters and widgets in 7 should have looked. The only small problem was that this is enabled by Drupal 5, enabled by PHP 5.3 having native namespaces, and Drupal 7 was 5.2. So only 8 has this. And then there's a place where the metadata lives. This is typically, as we have seen, is a doctrine annotation. There can be other places. Those are much more rare, and because I want to focus on entities, I will not dwell on it. I'm just going to mention that there are other implementations. In Drupal 8, everything has alternatives. Everything can be replaced. There's practically nothing hardwired. Drupal 8 is the embodiment of Sam Boyer's law, which says, Drupal, if we do it, we overdo it. Because everything is replaceable, even things that were never really praised shouldn't be replaced, and it just makes things extremely hard to follow because of the levels of abstraction necessary to replace everything. And finally, there's a plugin manager for every plugin type. Plugin manager essentially has two tasks. One is to get you the plugin definitions. It finds the plugins and it gives you the definition of plugins. And based on that, it can create instances of these plugins. So if you actually want to format your field, then you talk to the field formatter plugin manager to give me an instance of this particular formatter. You get an object and you can call it to actually format your field. That's what the plugin manager needs to do and can do. The definition for a plugin, as I have mentioned, is often just an array, but some more complicated definitions are objects, because that way it can contain some simple logic maybe, but mostly because it is documentable. This is another limitation of the language. You cannot document arrays, and because of that, a lot of things are objects, which makes no sense to be objects. They should be simple arrays, but because there is no way to document them, they are not. This is, by the way, the same reason why so much things became objects in 8, which shouldn't have, is again a language limitation, because you can autoload classes and you cannot autoload functions. So, plugin types in Drupal 8. For 7 I have mentioned field formatters, field widgets, blocks. Well, and maybe one or two more. There are not that many of this pattern in 7. But in Drupal 8, there are many, like a real lot. Here are, I believe these are all the plugin types in 8. In 8 core. Because obviously anybody can define more. Some modules have jumped on the plugin bandwagon more than others. Menu has 4, migrate has 5, it will have more. Views has 19. If you remember, in 7 views were using already CTools plugins, so this is not an entirely new concept. The whole plugin system was written mostly by CTools maintainers, who took everything that was bad about and unloved about CTools plugins and left that behind, and then wrote Drupal 8 plugins from the ground up because there was nothing left. Okay, so I was yabbering here. I was yabbering here about a lot of stuff, mostly about plugins, plugin types, plugin definitions, plugin managers. So can we finally talk about entities when this was supposed to be a presentation about entities? Actually, I have been talking about them for a while now, because as I have mentioned, entities happen to be plugins. all entities are a single plugin type. They are the entities plugin type, and accordingly there's an entity manager. So entity is a plugin type. It has a namespace. It's just Drupal module name entity. There's an interface. It's just entity interface. There's an annotation. It's called entity type. And accordingly, because the annotation is entity type, the manager is called the entity type manager. There are a lot of kinds of entities in Drupal 8. Did I mention that we overdo everything? Quite a few of these should not have ever become entities. We are recognizing this slowly, but it's unfixable until Drupal 9. So all these things here are things that in Drupal 7 we call these entity types. This is going to be the most confusing part of all of it. In Drupal 8, these are actually entity type IDs, because, as I have mentioned already, the entity type is actually an object. It is the plugin definition object. So entity type is an object. The entity type ID is the string. It is the machine name of the entity type. But in speech, we often call these still, and documentation and everywhere else, we still call these entity types, just to make it more confusing. This is also in core and even probably in this presentation. But when you write actually module code, please be extremely careful to use the right variable name. And remember this set puppy, which is how your code reviewer will look if you mix the two up. Okay? Please make your code readable. Entity type is an object. Entity type ID is a string. So entities, as I said, they are a single plugin type, so there are common features. There's a way to query entities. This is like entity field query in 7, but while that one was, I think the best word to use for it, because I wrote it, is brain dead. I wrote this one too, but this is somewhat less brain dead. This is actually much more usable, which was made possible by certain enhancements that we did to entities in Drupal 8. So the brain deadness is somewhat can be defended in 7, because in 7 the whole entity concept was introduced very, very late in the cycle. So in Drupal 7 the whole entity API was not really well working at all. There is a simple static to load a given entity type, node load, comment load, and so forth. Once you have loaded an entity, you can run an access check on it, you can save it, you can delete it. These are the fundamental common features of entities. Now we are going to split. The two main kinds of entities are, one is the configuration entities. This is an entirely new thing to Drupal 8, and a lot of ad hoc things that were just, as I said, ad hoc in earlier Drupals became configuration entities. These are stored in the configuration storage, which is one of the nicer things in 8. Everything is now in a configuration management that you can take your configuration object, you can export them, import it into your live site, you can translate your configuration. It is really nice. One of the few real nice things in 8. For configuration entities, the ID is a machine name. These entities, the entity object itself contains logic. So what we can talk about? For example, it can be, as you can see, a few rows down, image styles are configuration entities. So when you want to apply the style, it will iterate over the effects and call them. It's nothing complicated, but still, that's where the logic lives. Once again, text formats, very similar mechanism. When you want to actually run the text formatting, it iterates over the filters, calls them, caches the result if it's possible, and so forth. So configuration entities will have some logic in the entity. They will also have dependency handling. That is another very nice feature of the configuration management. If you have a text format which depends on a filter, then enabling then loading that config will only succeed if that module exists. And even if you try to enable a module, then it can tell that it depends on the other module just based on configuration dependencies. And where somewhat your sanity begins to unravel, it will get worse. These are often backed by other plugins. As I mentioned, image effects, text filters. These are themselves are plugins, right? Again, this is something where plugins make sense, because image effects, that will have an interface which mostly is just apply. So you will have resize, you will have a crop, and so forth. All those image effects, and the only thing visible to the world will be that method where you can actually apply the image effects. Where this gets somewhat confusing is that I have mentioned that entities themselves are plugins. So you have a plugin which contains the configuration for a whole bag of other plugins. It can get a little confusing of which plugin are you working with at a given time. Then there are content entities. These are familiar. These are the only entities that you had in 7. These are stored in the entity storage. Remember, configuration entities were stored in the configuration storage. The entity storage defaults to SQL. It looks similar to how 7 was stored. It's not the same, but it's similar. The ID is a serial. Although all entities, I forgot to include this, all entities have a UUID. For some reason, we kept an ID as well for content entities. There are a lot of reasons for having an ID. It is if you see it in a URL, a UUID is really not nice, although that will be solvable by aliases. Also, joining on strings is much slower than joining on integers. This could be solved by using a database instead of a joke, but moving to PostgreSQL is not yet supported by everybody. So we kept a serial ID. Most of the time it is okay, unless you are trying to run a multi-master site where it is absolutely not going to work. This limits Drupal. Thanks God, the entity storage is entirely pluggable, as everything in Drupal 8, so you can get rid of it. That's good. Content entities don't really have logic. Maybe a little, but most of the time they don't. There is no need or reason to have any logic. It's just a value object. It holds things. That's the only thing it needs to do, and that's the only thing it does. All the functionality are in different classes. So if you want to check access, that is in an access handler. If you want to store the entity, that is in the storage handler. It's not in the entity itself. The nicest thing about them is that every property is a field. Gone is the distinction between things like node title was a property, node body was a field. This is gone. Everything is a field, and it is handled the same, it looks the same, and is the same actually all the time. There are two ways to work with a field. One is entity, arrow field name, arrow column name, like node, title, value. The problem with this one is that there is a lot of magic to make it work. So it is A, slower, B, the ID integration is necessarily less, because there is not really a way for the ID to figure out this magic that goes behind. The other is that we have methods for reaching these fields. In this case, just node get title. This is very strongly preferred. So here are, I have marked the content entities. As you can see, they are much fewer than configuration entities, and most of them are familiar from 7. What may be less familiar, block content wasn't called an entity in 7, but that's just custom blocks. Contact messages are now a proper entity. They are not yet stored as such. One of the things that might happen in 8.1, Laurent is working on this, is to actually store them and use this capability to have a web form light in core. Menu link content is a new one. Previously, menu links were not entities and were not really a good way to work with them. Yes, you could load them, you could save them, but it was not really meant to do that. The only real way was to work with them from the UI or define them from hook menu. That's gone. Hook menu is completely gone. It has been split into a billion things. One of them is menu link content. You can have all your custom links are content and menu link content entities. The rest is familiar. We know them. So I mentioned fields, and I said that they are the same. They are the same when you use them. but there are two ways to define them. Usage and definition is very much not the same. There are base fields like node title, and there are configurable fields, an image or tags. This is what were fields in 7. What were just fields in 7 now are called configurable fields. The base fields are defined in code, and configurable fields are in a configuration entity. As I said, it gets worse, and this is where it gets worse. So you have the entity, you have all your fields, and the field definition is another entity. But only the field definition, because the entity definition is sex god, it's not an entity. I'm going to repeat this. You have the entity, you have your fields, and the configurable fields, the definition of them is an entity, but the definition of the whole entity is not another entity. Fields are bound to a bundle and not an entire entity type. This is also familiar, right? We had vocabularies for terms, we had node types for nodes. The bundle information, so like vocabularies and node types, are again a configuration entity. Yes.
And if you port entity construction kit, then the entity type would also be a configuration entity.
We are not going there. Not today. So, I think I have mentioned this already, but I will mention it a lot of times because this is hard to not mix up. All entities are a single plugin type. The definition of entity plugins are called entity types. Bundles of the entity type node are called node types. Actually not. The human name for the node type, entity type, is content types. We should have renamed node module to content module. We didn't. Inside. So let's see how can you get from one of these things to other things. You have the entity, and it has a method called getEntityType. This gets the definition object. So here's an example, node. This is not the whole definition of node. It wouldn't fit in a single slide. It wouldn't fit in 2 slides, probably a dozen. It's a very long definition. But here's an excerpt of them. So it's a content entity type. It has an ID, it has label, and all sorts of things. As you can see, the definition is a content entity type. Node itself is a content entity base. I will get back to that. So this part up there is the entity definition, and then there's the entity itself. Let's not mix those up. It's get definition that moves from one to the other. So, reminder, the entity type node getEntityType gets you the definition. Let me go back to the previous slide. It gets the entity definition. The entity definition is not an entity. It is not a node type because the node type is an entity. Node is an entity, but node type is not an entity type. No, the entity getEntityType gets you the definition. It's just that. It's the definition. It's nothing else. And it is the same for every node. That's why it's a definition. So let's talk about how do you jump around in bundles. As we have just discussed, get entity type gets the definition. Once you have the entity type object, there's a method called get bundle entity type, which is a misnomer because it actually gives you the entity type ID. So for example, if you run this code on Node get an entity type which gets you the definition, and then you can ask about the bundle entity type. It is going to be Node type, hopefully to nobody's surprise. So Node type is a config entity. You can load it like that. If you print out the ID of it, it is going to be the thing that you have loaded. Now, how do we get the string node if we have a node type? We need the definition to jump. So, we take the entity type of the node type, right? We can do that. Node type is an entity. Every entity has an entity type, which is the definition. And then the definition will have information for us. In this case, it is what is this the bundle of? It is the bundle of nodes. Again, I think I mentioned this a few times. That node type get entity type is not an entity. It is the definition, and this is the same for every node type. Now, be careful with base class names, because they are very, very similar, deceptively similar, and confusingly similar. Anything extending the config entity base class is a config entity, but anything extending the config entity type is the definition of a config entity. So, node type is extending, hands up, who thinks that it extends config entity base? Who thinks it is extending config entity type?
It's not a config entity.
Node type is a config entity, and it is not an entity type. So it is extending the config entity base. Once again, the definition of entity plugins are called entity types. And the bundles of nodes are called node types. Now, same for content entities. Anything extending the content entity base is a content entity. Anything extending the content entity type is the definition of a content entity. So, a little quiz here. Who thinks that this is true? Who thinks this is false? Awesome. Awesome. Okay, great. I wasn't wasting my time then. Great. Okay. Who thinks this is true? Yeah, this is true. Node is an entity, it's not an entity type. Let's see something harder. Who thinks that this is true? That is correct. Who thinks this is correct? Who thinks this is true?
After the last one, this is...
Yeah, this is false. So, if you want a mnemonic, probably the easiest way to remember this is node is an entity, but node type is not an entity type. This is perhaps the easiest way to remember this. And finally, is this true? Who thinks this is true? No, it's not. So, about this was what I wanted to talk about. This will haunt you anytime when you try to port a Drupal 7 module. I was working on porting organic groups. it gets awfully badly confusing. But perhaps now that I have been talking about it for an hour, maybe it will be a little bit easier for you. It
So isn't
Okay.
each vocabulary a bundle of taxonomy?
Yes, it is, but that is the bundle of terms. There is no such thing as something which is a bundle of vocabularies.
Okay.
So that one only takes one step.
Okay.
There are no more. You cannot take more than one step in that direction. As far as I am aware, the support is there, but nobody is doing it. And
There are bundle methods on config entity type, but they're inherited from entity type.
Oh, I see.
So they don't I don't think anybody did something with that or.
yeah, I don't even think it is tested because that is some kind of mad
But
less.
then actually there is entity type and then config entity and the other is derivative.
Content entity, yes.
So both is then using that as a file.
Yes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, there's content entity type and config entity type in the base classes, the type.
Yes, but yes, this is.
Well, I mean, it seems like that the naming is what makes it so confusing.
Yes, as I mentioned, picking or keeping the name for node types and for entity types both, when they are so different concepts. Because honestly, they were used as such in 7 already. The only thing was that we weren't using them so much. But you will find that you will very often need, when you want to read a method, when you want to read the metadata about an entity, you need the entity type object for it. So you will actually work with both very often, and that's the problem. In 7, the conflict was much less because they were used much less often. But once again, the conflict arises from the fact that node is an entity, but node type is not an entity type. That is horrible. This is plain horrible.
Yeah, so one could just replace this part of Drupal and completely fork it and just do a string replace and
Yes, you could.
put that in as a config module, then and say this is a developer experience helping module.
The problem is that you would probably break backwards compatibility because it is very likely that node type as a string will be hardwired. It is very, very likely that you will have a couple things which runs instance of content entity type interface for certain things. So actually these things are already relevant and you cannot just. So Drupal would work, but it would break backwards compatibility. And we have promised people that we will not do that for 8.
Yeah, okay, we will not do that for people, but we can do it just for ourselves. We could, right? So
yes, but
it would work exactly the same way. It would just use a different naming convention, and then.
Yes, but nothing would work, you know.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's a problem.
And in order to do that, you already need to understand how this works now. And if you understand there's no reason
No.
to change it.
No, I will take a look at Twig instead. Sounds more easy.
You think so? In Drupal 7, if you mess up escaping, you have a security hole. In Drupal 8, if you mess up escaping, you have double escaped strings, which is merely not nice, but it's not a security hole. So even though that one can be tricky sometimes to get it right, the worst that can happen is you have a double escape string. So that's fine. So I think Twig is okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? Károly, this is the I mean, you have the opportunity to ask chicks, so this is doesn't.
I have a question. What is the purpose of the plugin storage handler?
Oh, which one?
Plugin storage handler.
What's the purpose of?
Or the plugin storage. When we define a plugin, so we have to define some handlers for the plugin.
Oh, so storage handler is only for entities. Storage handler is a concept only for entities, and that's where you store, and that's how you store your entities. That's why you have a storage handler. There are two storage handlers in core, one for config entities, which stores them in the config storage, and one is the SQL storage, which stores them in 4 base tables, and then and then in separate field tables, as in 7. So these are two kinds of, but these are only for entities. Plugins themselves don't have storage handlers. That's not a concept. Only entities. You can only store entities.
Okay, and how can I solve the problem if I define plugin interface and I want to make difference between the plugins by design? So every plugin can have a brand, and I only work with the first one. If the first one doesn't work, I forward to the next one, and the next one, and the next one.
So you want to have, well, there are fallback mechanisms. I don't know, I don't think there is a general multi-step fallback mechanism. There, for example, filters have fallbacks, and I think that the plugin bag itself has a mechanism for fallback, so that you can actually define a fallback plugin, but that is only one. You know?
So maybe it is similar to the image toolkit. Maybe my system is configured to use the image magic as an image toolkit, and maybe it is some reason it's not available. It's fallback to the standard.
Yeah. So there is a thing called fallback plugin manager interface, which, for example, the filter plugin manager implements, and that one has a method called get fallback plugin ID. But that's only one fallback. But that's a single fallback. You can't do a full waterfall. I mean, you would need to write it. What we have is that if this filter is missing, use filter null, and that is true and that is the fallback for every filter.
But this task is assigned to the plugin manager.
Yes. This is what core offers, right? You can write whatever you want. You know, you can define one way or another. You can write a plugin manager which which can handle a whole chain of fallback if that's what you want or need. Remember that creating plugin instances is fully the responsibility of a plugin manager. It is encapsulated within the plugin manager. So if you need a cascading thing, then you override the create instance method of the default plugin manager and do whatever you need to do. You could put weights in your plugin, in the annotation of your plugins, or you can have like pointers, you know, that this is my plugin, and if this doesn't work, then fall back to that one, and then build up like the module dependencies. You can do that. You can reuse the same mechanism. All of this is encapsulated. It is in one place, and it's your plugin manager.
I have a question too. In a nutshell, which part of Drupal 8 are you the most satisfied with?
Twig. We went from basically a fundamentally insecure system to a fundamentally secure system. This is a huge win. My job is such that I usually see the worst sides. And it is typical that these end up with contrib modules and all pieces of custom logic in your theme. Ensuring that such a code base, and I'm emphasizing this is a common practice, this is a very bad practice, but it's common. Ensuring that such a site is access-as-whole free very often is more expensive than porting it to Drupal 8. It is, I'm not saying it is impossible to make a Drupal 7 site access-as-whole free. It is just, it can be extremely expensive if somebody have wrote a real lot of custom templates. You need to go over every single print. You need to go over every single print command to ensure that the piece of data is actually somewhere filtered somehow. And where does it come from? Who knows? This is gone in 8. Unless somebody bends over backwards and marks an unsafe string as safe, and that is not easy to do. You cannot have XSS holes. And very nicely, people who write the theme layer, same as I mentioned, will default to being safe instead of defaulting to being unsafe. This is the absolute best. This is an incredible big thing. The other very big thing that I am very happy that is going to rock the world is, you surely have heard that everything became multilingual in Drupal 8. But that alone is of course very nice. But what rocks the world is that together with in-place editing. What this means is that if you need to translate your site, you can outsource it without training people in your admin interface. And that is extremely huge. That is, and you can translate every piece of your site because multilingual is everywhere, and you can do it in place. And I am unaware of any product, closed or open source, that would offer anything even remotely close. There is a shopping cart called Xcart which can do it, but it's a shopping cart and honestly not much else. And that product has its own problems, quite a few to say the least. So there is basically nothing can do it. It's so huge. It's so huge. Nobody does this. You know, most commercial CMSs have a very delimited admin and front interface. It is not even in their Word to offer something like this. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't fit in their worldview to be able to do this. Drupal has wanted to do this. In-place editing was investigated in Stephen Witten's Summer of Code project in 2005 or 6. I can't remember which, but it was almost 10 years ago when we already wanted it, and back then we couldn't do it. Now with the current entity API we can, and on top of that now you have this multilingual stuff. It's extraordinary. These are the things that I'm most happy about. So in-place editing, multilingual, and Twig. These are the big things in Drupal 8, and I believe that these are the things that are going to sell Drupal 8 as well. It's not just I'm satisfied with it, but these are the things that will sell it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Okay, then thank you very much. Thank you, Károly, for this great presentation. And there's still food in the kitchen, and we have beer and wine and of course non-alcoholic beverages. So thank you very much, and feel free to have some more drinks.
És most, hogy nem streamelünk, akár most már magyarul is lehet kérdezni.
Hát vannak nem magyar vendégeink.
Attól még kérdezni szabad magyarul.